I used the Harvard platform to help me get in touch with, for instance, Tommy Hilfiger, Jimmy Choo, and Dolce & Gabbana, who all later became my mentors or bosses. I think the key about networking is really about, building that authenticity and that genuine connection. You should only think of them when you need something from them. Develop the thickest skin possible. You just have to continually advocate for yourself and not be discouraged, even if it seems like you start from, really from scratch.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Learning of Leaders series. It's good to see you all connecting with us today. And as always, I'm joined here by Peter. Peter, good to see you. We have the privilege today to have Lynn Yu, the CEO of Jason Wu, who will be telling us all about our career. Peter, floor is all yours.
Thank you, Luc, and it's good to see you again. I'm so happy as we are getting into May, wonderful time of the year, of course, and also a wonderful speaker that we will welcome today in just a minute. It is Lynn Yu, as you said, Lynn, who is the CEO of Jason Wu, a very famous fashion label, of course, from New York City, who has had an amazing run already in her career. And she has worked for places like Tommy Hilfiger, Chanel, and even in a previous life, you could say, in the banking industry at places like Goldman Sachs. So I can't wait to hear her story. Lynn, thanks so much for joining us. And we always start with this very simple question. How are you and where are you?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for having me. It's definitely an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with the students today. And to answer your question, I am in New York at the moment. And yeah, we're doing well. Definitely feeling spring is in the air. And, as you know, vaccinations are pretty widely underway here. So we're feeling more and more optimistic about having some sense of normalcy back in our lives, both professional and social this summer. So very excited.
Yeah, I'm sure that that's really nice and a real relief for New York City. I mean, like New York, which has been the most vibrant city of the world. Now, of course, in many fields, finance, media, but also fashion. I mean, like, who can imagine a world of fashion without New York? What does it mean for you? I mean, have you been able to go back to the office, or are you, thinking about organizing shows again, the runway? I mean, like, what's the situation at Jason Wu?
Yeah, so, work-wise, we're definitely pursuing a hybrid approach where we work partly in the office and partly at home, to make sure that we don't have too many people in the office at the same time. And yet a lot of our staff are designers and pattern makers, so they definitely need to have that in-person experience in order to do their jobs most effectively. So we have this hybrid approach, and as more people are vaccinated, we feel more and more comfortable being, seeing each other in person. And in terms of our plans for New York Fashion Week, I don't know if you've been following the last two fashion weeks in New York. Jason Wu was actually the first and only brand that opened up both New York Fashion Weeks last September in 2020 and February of this year, as the only show that staged a physical COVID tested and socially distant show, where most designers are pursuing a virtual presentation. So we're happy to, be the sort of the last man standing, if you will, that really supported New York Fashion Week, and we'll continue to do so this upcoming September, when I believe that most other designers will also be looking to stage a fashion or in-person fashion show as well.
Yeah, I mean, the first or the last man standing, you said, or the first person to get up again, to rise again, if you will. I mean, and it's fascinating, of course, and it's so encouraging to hear that it is possible to go to that kind of what people have come to call a new normal almost. What are some of the learnings that you've had, in this past year and a half, let's say, in terms of how to operate?
I would say, there's a myriad of learnings from having gone through the pandemic, which is obviously unprecedented for all of us in our lifetimes, I presume. And I would say some of the key elements that come to mind would be first, from a distribution perspective, We've always known, even in the pre-pandemic era, that e-com has taken on an increasingly larger share of the total sales of most brands. And so COVID has only accelerated that trend, in a sense that for a long time, when we had severe lockdowns and restrictions, brick and mortar was non-existent. So e-com was the lifeline for many brands to really build that direct consumer relationship during this time. So it certainly is not a trend that's going to go away after the pandemic.
What's the number there? Or the order of magnitude? Are we talking about 20% e-commerce? Are we talking about 50%? What's the number?
I would say overall as an industry, pre-COVID, it was probably 15 to 85. 15 being e-com and 85 being brick and mortar. But now, I have to look at the latest statistics. I'm guessing it's probably a quarter, if not more, a quarter to a third of the total sales for many brands who had to pivot very quickly from wholesale to direct to consumer. So, yeah.
But yet, Lynn, I mean, yet when I see here in Geneva, of course, not the world capital of fashion as New York is or other cities are. We've reopened stores a couple of weeks ago, and the first lines to see, that I saw were in places like Chanel and like the very high, the Versace's, like the really luxury fashion. Everybody wants to, it seems at least, wants to go back to the store. So do you see that in New York too and elsewhere?
Yeah. Absolutely. We see this, what's known as the revenge shopping pattern that we first saw when China reopened its economy after the pandemic was largely recovered. So there was people lining outside of the doors of Chanel and other luxury brands to get a taste of it, even though some of these brands actually had price increases during the pandemic to raise their margins. But people didn't care, and people were very hungry for any kind of luxury or anything that would sort of relieve some of the stress coming from the pandemic. So we certainly see that in New York as well. I mean, like if you look at March, for instance, as a month, the US retail sales rose by 9.8% in total. And at Jason Wu, we also see the same trend sort of echoed in our own data as well. We, did very well at some of our top department stores, Bergdorf, Saks, et cetera. So it's definitely encouraging to see a rebound in retail sales, and hope that will continue going forward.
So, let's talk a little bit specifically about indeed, the experience of Jason Wu, not just in this past year, but, sort of overall the story of Jason Wu. Where does it fit in the fashion universe? And you've worked, you can compare because you've worked for many fashion labels in the past decade or so.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those, those of you who don't know Jason Wu as well, Jason started the brand about 14 years ago. And he started the brand mostly as a niche designer that's focused solely on American luxury. So, this idea that European brands typically dominate the luxury sphere and Americans are just sportswear and whatnot, Jason was very, determined to break that tradition and infuse some elements of American sportswear with European couture craftsmanship. So he was really aiming at a combination of that. And since then, we've sort of built out our brand pyramid in such a way that we're not only well represented in the luxury world, but also equally developed in the contemporary space as well as the mass space. So we now have 3 labels: Jason Wu Collection sitting at the luxury level, Jason Wu sitting at the contemporary price point, and then Jason Wu sitting at the mass price point to really be able to speak and target each segment of the consumer effectively. And we've also expanded in terms of categories. So starting only as a ready-to-wear, but now also pivoting into beauty and homeware as well. So looking to build a brand out further as I continue this journey with them.
Yeah, and it seems like, when you make those comparisons between brands, that there are indeed a couple of things that sort of come back, right? I mean, you've also worked for Tommy Hilfiger. They also have like that sort of more high-end level, and then they have like the Hilfiger denim, I suppose, which is more so that mass market. So that sounds rather familiar. If you were to share maybe one thing about the fashion industry for people that are interested in it as a business, let's say, maybe as a career, that they should know if they want to make their entry into the fashion industry and they'll impress people with that they know, what would that be?
I would say obviously the cliche is that it's not all glam and fun, it's a lot of hard work and persistence, and I would certainly say that's true, but I would also add that maybe a lot of people think that you have to start out in fashion in order to be able to make it in industry. You have to climb the ladder or whatever to really get to the top. But I would argue the opposite. You know, a lot of people I know started out or majored even in school in things that are vastly different from fashion, and later ended up in the sector. You know, either they transitioned midway through their careers, or they, you know, they've taken up a hobby and they've launched their own brand. So I think it's very safe to say that is a myth, to, you know, that you have to start as an intern and work your way up, but that if you have the passion, you should be able to find your way here in, you know, one way or another. So don't be discouraged.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, I remember that you told me in a preparatory conversation that one of those things that made you stand out in the fashion industry was how you, and you've studied, we'll talk a little bit more about your past, but you've done an MBA, you've worked in finance and other sectors. And one of the things that made you stand out in the fashion industry when you joined it was the fact that you had like a really keen interest and perhaps also a little bit of knowledge about the real estate markets, which, you know, it didn't strike me immediately as like a key thing to succeed in the fashion industry, but in fact it turned out to be extremely, or it turns out to be extremely important to know, you know, where do you have to be, which markets, which cities, you know, what places, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, you know, definitely built out my real estate knowledge of fashion when I was at Chanel, where obviously, as you know, Chanel is very well known for not sort of embracing e-com head first. And it was very much about brick and mortar and about the boutique experience. So there it was really important to master, you know, the different intricacies of various markets in the US, to be able to understand, okay, where should we open or close stores? Where should we renovate certain stores? How should we lay out the floor plan? What should the ratio be, front of house, back of house? Who should our adjacencies be? What kind of lease arrangements should we have with the landlords in that market? So all these things definitely play a role in how your brand is being perceived to consumers, especially when brick and mortar is your predominant choice of distribution. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then another thing, which, you know, we've talked, for example, to a couple of leaders in the watch industry. Now, watches, of course, are very different from fashion, but what they have in common is that it's a luxury item that people, luxury wearable, if you will. And one of the things that I was struck by when we talked to, you know, the CEOs of these big Swiss watching manufacturers was how important the Chinese market was for them. You know, up to 50% of sales, you know, in general, globally, but then how it accelerated even during the pandemic, because already in March or April of last year, you know, the stores were filling up again in China. Now, what, you know, to what extent does that play a role at, and maybe a special role at a company like Jason Wu, which, you know, Jason, for those who don't know, I believe he's Taiwanese Canadian. Yes. Right? And then you share a little bit of that sort of cultural background. You're Chinese American, is that right?
Right. Yeah. So we're both native Mandarin speakers, and we both share a real tie to that region of the world. You know, much of our family still reside in that part of the world. So we certainly feel a sense of, you know, almost responsibility to be able to carve out the Jason Wu brand in that market, even if it wasn't in such a booming market as it is now, which it is. So yeah, we're actually very happy to report that last July, we were able to open our first global flagship at the IFC Mall in Shanghai. And just last week, we opened up our second boutique at the Kerry Center in Shanghai as well. So looking ahead, we're definitely looking to further expand both retail, wholesale, and e-com in China. And I think, you know, to your point, COVID, even pre-COVID, China's power was already undisputed in the fashion industry, and it's been further cemented since the pandemic started, you know, as it's one of the first markets to reopen. So we certainly hope to be able to leverage our cultural affinity to further build out our presence in the market.
Yeah. Do you expect that it will ever, or maybe in a couple of years, be like it is for the watching industry? It will be like the dominant consumer market?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's safe to say it's already top two, but, you know, as to when exactly it's going to surpass the US, that is still a question, but I think we're definitely heading in that direction. Yeah.
And perhaps finally on that point, you know, it was interesting when you mentioned about, you know, sort of the identity of Jason Wu as a fashion brand, that it was sort of a merger between what was typically seen as North American or American and European, which of course is where a lot of the legacy and the history of luxury fashion lies. You know, to what extent do you see a shift, or can you expect a shift towards, like, say, more like an Asian influence in like the top couture, in the top fashion market?
Well, I think Jason's designs are built for, women who appreciate craftsmanship and couture-like sensibilities, and whether that person is, Caucasian or Asian or Hispanic or African American, it doesn't matter. It's really about sharing that appreciation for the finer things in life. And so I think he pays close attention when he attends every fitting, first of all, and so he pays very close attention to how a dress is fitted on the woman's body, and he's always a great listener to his consumers' feedback. So from that perspective, I think he definitely dresses the woman in the way that she would like to feel, and confident, empowered. So it's very much part of the DNA. And so yes, he started as Michelle Obama's favorite designer. They worked together over 50 times over the course of her being first lady in the White House for 8 years. But he certainly, expanded his reach beyond that. So it's really targeting women of all races and colors, really. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Obviously, as a man, I'm probably not as well placed to give any kind of opinion on
I highly doubt
fashion.
that.
But when I look at men's fashion, or at least, like, let's say what people wear in business occasions, that's still, like, say, a product of like a sort of an old French British sort of legacy of like the jacket, etc. So are you saying that in women's fashion, it's much more universal, it's much more global, and it's much more about, let's say, the woman as such, as opposed to like the culture in which from which she comes?
I mean, he certainly, I would say, infuses the best of both worlds, right? He, he only does women's wear, so I can only speak to that, but he definitely is well trained, in terms of his technical skills. It's second to none. And I would argue that he's probably one of the best of this generation in terms of his pure design skills. And also he comes from this multicultural background. So he's able to sort of, when we talk about inspiration and mood boards for each season, that starts the beginning of each collection, he really infuses elements from the West, from the East, and then just puts it all together, which I find so unique. So for instance, our pre-fall collection is largely based on this very glamorous Shanghainese woman from the 20s and the 30s, very similar to the Roaring 20s in the US, which is our sort of inspiration for the upcoming resort collection. So I think from there, you can really see that he's just, a hodgepodge of all things, artistic, if you will.
Yeah, that's really amazing to hear. I'm sure we'll get a lot more questions about that from our students, Lynn, because actually there's a lot of students that are studying luxury fashion, or fashion luxury rather, fashion luxury business. So we'll hear from them in just a few minutes. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your career, because we've now spent time talking about Jason Wu and the company. Absolutely amazing to see you there. But like, you yourself have had an amazing run in your career as well so far. You're, I suppose, also in your mid-30s like I am. I'm happy to be interviewing you. You're actually the CEO. Did you always know that you were going to be the CEO of a fashion label, or was that always a dream to you?
It was certainly always a dream. I even wrote about it in my admissions essays when I was applying to Harvard. So, it dates back decades. But certainly was an absolute surprise. And I had absolutely no idea that this was the opportunity that was going to be presenting itself at the time that it did. So I would say that, as a young person who comes into such a senior role, it is especially crucial for you to have a certain level of vision and conviction in your vision, to be able to get the level of buy-in that you need from your shareholders, and also from all your retail partners as well. So it's important to have them see you as a person with gravitas and poise and a strategic plan that's very well built out, in order to really command a certain amount of credibility in the industry. And I would also say that especially as a young person, that you have to remain humble at all times and be a good listener to a lot of the people who's worked for Jason in the company for many, many years. They're veterans and they know their fields inside out. So you really should collaborate with them and see them as subject experts rather than trying to, pursue that more top-down traditional approach of CEO to staff. So it's more of a teamwork dynamic, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, but of course, you've also had experience, in various sectors. You did some internships in the finance sector. You worked in finance and in other sectors as well. And actually, when you started out as a college student, I want to maybe tell that story, or let you tell that story about, it really all started, I suppose, when you got accepted at Harvard. I mean, this is a place where like only 3 or 4% of people who apply even get into. What was that like for you? What do you attribute that to, that you managed to be one of those 3 or 4%?
I would attribute it to two people. One was my Harvard interviewer, and the other was my mom. So as you know, I came to the US when I was 14, so quite late in the game. And at that point, it was already high school. And so everything counted toward your college admission. So not being able to speak English was a huge disadvantage coming in. But, by the time I got to be a senior, I thought, should I apply to Harvard? But I thought at the time it was even crazy for me to think about applying to a school like Harvard, because why would they want me? There's so many more qualified, better candidates, objectively, who's much better suited for the school. So then I thought, if you don't apply, the answer is always no. So I'd rather just, spend the $50 admissions fee and say, get a no, than to always wonder what if. So that's what I did. And luckily I was paired with this Harvard interviewer who was an alum. He is actually, I think, one of the first Harvard college student and Harvard Business School student of color. He's of African descent. He, was a Vietnam War veteran, so very old, but he definitely, I think, saw some potential in me. And over the course of my senior year, continued to advocate for my candidacy to the admissions committee and help me refine my essays and application materials, so that by the end I managed to get off the waiting list. So wow. He definitely played a huge role in that. And of course, my mom, whom has always been there for me through all my ups and downs, and certainly was there to cheer me on through this very rigorous and grueling process. So I always have to defer back to them for
and it's really inspiring to hear that part of the story too, isn't it? Because now of course you're an established professional, like an executive, leading teams and working in teams. But of course, at some point in your very early on in your life, you had to get, let's say, a chance, right? With all the talent and all the potential that you had. So, then though, what I thought was interesting is that when you were in your undergrad and also in your MBA, you start to have that sort of focus, like, this is where I want to go. This is the kind of companies that I'm interested in. And I thought you had a very interesting technique in terms of like getting on the radar of these companies that you were interested in. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, I wanted always to, play a part in the fashion industry in one way or another, but having no industry connections whatsoever, I was like, where do I start? So I joined a number of student organizations on campus, both when I was in undergrad and in B school. And I used the Harvard platform as a way to sort of help me get in touch with some of the leaders in the industry that I really looked up to and wanted to, build a relationship with someday. So I reached out to them via, as to invite them to speakers for the conferences. And to my delight, I was able to, secure approval from quite a few. So from, for instance, Donna Karen, Jimmy Choo, and Dolce & Gabbana, who all later became my mentors or bosses in my career. So that definitely played a role. But I would say that a lot of the invitation process was very challenging in the sense that it was pre-social media and pre-internet. So I had to rely on very traditional techniques of even looking up a customer service number and using that as the way in to eventually get to the CEO's office and then make a pitch to have them come and speak. So it was quite the process, but I think it developed quite a thick skin that helps me later in life as well.
I mean, it's so interesting. Like literally cold calling a company, on its customer service number, and then getting on the radar by being able to show your interest. interviewing these people. I mean, like I maybe hope that one day I can work for Jason Wu now that I've interviewed you. But
you're happy to take my, I mean, I'd be happy to give you my position. Yeah.
But joking aside, you know, of course, you've worked in fashion for various companies by now. You've worked for Jimmy Choo, you've worked for Lance, and you've worked for Chanel. You've worked for Tommy Hilfiger, and now, of course, you're at Jason Wu. One of the things that I thought was interesting was how you, you know, that you switch sometimes jobs at very special moments, not just in your professional life, but also in your personal life. Could you tell us a little bit more about those special moves and how they happened?
Sure. So I would say, interestingly, the last two career moves both happened while I was on maternity leave. So Tommy Hilfiger happened right after the arrival of the first baby, and then Jason Wu right after the arrival of the second. So not saying by any means there's correlations between, you know, having babies and making career moves, but it's just so happened that way for me. And what I would say was that it did give me time to take a pause and take stock of everything that I've accomplished to that point and think about what I want to build out for the, you know, next chapter of my career. So it gave me that time and opportunity to reflect, that which you don't typically get when you're, you know, on a job and you're just go all the time. So this was helpful in that sense. And I would say I credit some of these opportunities to my friends, you know, my friends from either school or from past career opportunities. They, you know, we stayed in touch, and I kept them in touch kept them informed of my career progress and aspirations. And so when it came time to, you know, to help me out, they certainly advocated for me, and they recommended me to one of the headhunters, which is how this Jason Wu opportunity came about. So
yeah, I mean, it's two really interesting sort of tidbits of your career, indeed. I mean, like on the one hand, and you know, we don't make any judgment about, you know, paternal and maternal leave in general. I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of countries, including the US, where things have to improve on that front, and where a lot of people are actually held back because they get children. But it really is really inspiring to see that if you have sort of a you know, that you can try and make something that sort of that the two go together, and you can indeed advance in a wonderful way in your career as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say most women probably think, you know, right after a baby, it's better to take a step back from the career because it's so much to juggle at home already. But you know, opportunities like this don't wait for you for the right time. You just have to jump on it. So I literally found out about, you know, this opportunity maybe 3 weeks after I gave birth. So really freshly out of the hospital, not thinking about this at all, but you know, I had to make it happen. So
yeah. And then the other thing that you touched on just now was sort of like how, you know, you don't wait to get in touch with someone until you need something from them, or until you know, you'd like them to help you with a future job application or so. But you say, look, I regularly just stay in touch with people in my professional network, and I reach out to them sometimes just to share some news, some updates about myself, so that, you know, when indeed the time comes when I'd love to sort of ask them something, you know, that doesn't come across as sort of unexpected or out of the blue.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the key about networking is really about, you know, building that authenticity and that genuine connection with whoever you look up to. And that should not be, you know, you should only think of them when you need something from them. That sounds very, you know, arbitrary and frankly forced. And so I think if I identify some sort of connection with an individual, I would try to, you know, hopefully have this person become my mentor, and then just regularly, like you said, update this person of my milestones in my career. And, you know, when the time comes, they will understand why I want to make a move and try to sort of throw their weight behind me, which makes it a much more seamless process.
Yeah, and clearly that has worked out for you at many steps along the way. You know, quickly already pulling in a question from one of the people that is watching is Swarna Rajas. She says, you know, you've worked at all these amazing companies. We just talked about them: Tommy, Chanel, Choo, Jason Wu. You know, she asked, what are some of your major learnings, let's say, from the previous experiences at all of these companies that you've had? What are some major takeaways and learnings?
There are many. So I would say the one thing I think that is sort of a constant theme across all these jobs, is that you have to be very adaptable, because, fashion as an industry is inherently fickle compared to other industries. It's driven by trends, it's seasonal by nature. So there is certainly this need to constantly evolve as the time goes on, and to be a leader in dictating trends and consumer needs in the market. But I would say also COVID certainly accelerated that further, whether it's supply chain or distribution or product strategy. From every angle you look at it, you have to quickly adapt and be one of the first to get there. So I think having that sort of nimbleness and agility is crucial to any role in fashion, I would say. And having gone through a number of different, functions, I would say, for me, it's not necessarily about specializing in any particular field, but it's really about having that holistic perspective, having had a taste in each function to be able to piece it all together.
Yeah. And if we look ahead to the future, because you already said, the fashion industry is one that changes so quickly and all the time. One of the things that I thought were interesting that you sort of saw emerge in the last couple of years, actually, particularly in China, as it happens, you have these sort of people that are very popular social influencers, social media influencers, who sort of unveil their own collection online to their followers, and then sell them out before they're even made. That's one of the things that's happening in China. I suppose it's also happening in the US. I don't know. You should maybe tell us whether that is the case. Do you see those kinds of trends that emerge really from the bottom up? Let's say, do they affect at all what's happening at the high end level of the fashion market?
I would say, yeah, they're certainly a disruptor in the market. Really, what they're doing is using their influencer network, or using their celebrity status to really make some collaborations, that appeal to their fan base, which I think is a very, it can drive a lot of commercial success, at least in the short term. Do I think they're necessarily a threat in the long term?
Or will you copy some of their features? Maybe is that something we're going to see in fashion as well? Fashion houses that sort of sell something before it's even made.
Well, in a way, fashion houses always sell something before it's made, because what you see on fashion runways, those are samples. So obviously, what goes into production depends on what the buyers are actually demanding from your line. So a lot of it is just prototypes that never get made. So in that sense, I do see the logic that runs parallels, that you want to present your dream show, your most ideal fantasy assortment, but then at the end of the day, it's still down to the buyers and the consumers who really tell you how they, which pieces they most resonate with. Yeah.
Excellent. Lynn, I've got so much more questions, but in fact, we've got some, real specialists with us as well, people that are studying, fashion in your business school. So why don't we bring them in at this point?
Yeah, please do.
And perhaps we start with Monica. Monica, who's from Sweden, also a fashion country, I'd say, but who's studying in Barcelona. And Monica, you had a question about sort of like the how fashion brands keep that sort of luxury appeal, I think, Monica.
Hi, Monica.
If you could just unmute quickly, and we'll wait for you. Yep, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, very inspiring listening to you. I'm so excited to be here. And probably you covered many of my questions already, but I do have this question that I would like to ask you, which is, do you think that lowering the price point of any luxury product category could damage the image of a luxury brand?
Hi, Monica. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. I would say the short answer is no, but it has to be very skillfully done. So, as I mentioned earlier with Peter, we build out this very well thought out brand pyramid where you have a luxury component, a contemporary component, and a mass component that makes up the pyramid. So the luxury component has to sit on the top and sort of generate this halo effect that cascades down to every tier of your brand pyramid, so that like people when people think of Jason Wu, they think of the genius that dresses the red carpet, celebrities. They don't necessarily think of what's selling at a more mass channel. I do believe that if you look at some of the case studies, for instance, Ralph Lauren, one of the most iconic American luxury brands, if you will. Ralph Lauren is definitely a brand that's very similar to ours in that they have a brand pyramid that is so well built out that yes, they have the light at the very top where they present themselves as a luxury brand during New York Fashion Week, but equally they span many different categories from home to ready to wear to accessories to many different categories. And they also distribute at every price point in every kind of retailer. So the way you do it is to, one, make sure that communication is always putting the spotlight on the sort of the more luxury sphere. And then also making sure that whatever you develop at the mass level is not a watered down version of your best, most iconic sellers at the luxury level. So what consumers don't want to see is, okay, if I pay $3,000 for a dress, I want it, obviously I expect it to be the epitome of luxury, but if I design something at $45, I don't want that dress to necessarily mimic all the elements of the luxury designer. It has to be able to stand on its own. It has to have distinctive differentiating factors that make it unique for that value proposition. So it's very important that you don't cannibalize your own products at a different price point, but that you do so in a very strategic way. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, to strategically build a pyramid to.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe to go on, Monica, if you wanted to ask a follow-up question.
I think it was a very good answer to my question, and we talk a lot about this during our classes. So it was very inspiring to hear your answer to this question. Thank you so much.
And maybe to follow up, Lynn, we see also this question from Asuman Goksel, one of the people in joining us today in the chat, and Asuman is asking, what is the most important asset for a luxury brand? What is that? Is that its design? Is that its real estate? Is that its e-commerce? Is that its what is the most important asset for a luxury brand?
I think, well, that's a great question. I think for us, I would say it's the founder's voice. So I think we're very lucky in the sense that Jason is not only alive and well, but he's very involved in every part of the design process. So it really truly lends that credibility to our brand in the market, where people see, okay, this is something that Jason has touched on, that he has worked on. So this is not a lot of brands can't succeed and survive after the passing or of a founder, or if somebody sold a business to somebody else, they can still carry on. But I think it would be more beneficial to have that designer who is able to directly use his appearance as the sort of the fundamental marketing vehicle for the company. I think there's no stronger sort of seal of approval than that. For instance, I mean, if you look at Alexander McQueen, certainly is a brand that did very well after the passing of Alexander, but I would say, certainly when he was alive, he definitely created an indelible mark on the brand that allowed it to continue its journey the way it has. So
yeah, it's really interesting, of course, to see that in fashion, indeed, many of the most famous brands and labels have indeed founders that are still active in the company, right? And that's maybe a little bit different than a lot of other companies that we see, or industries that we see. I mean, you've worked in finance, you've worked in Saks. I mean, like, I'm sure that Mr. Goldman and Mr. Saks, they had a very special style, but by now they've been dead for 100 years, and they're still the #1 in the market. So it's interesting to see if fashion would go that way. I mean, or simply just new brands emerge, new designers emerge. Another issue, of course, for the fashion industry is, let's say, its sustainability over time, and as part of the broader, let's say, supply chain. I think we have a question about that from Valeria. Valeria, who's from the Ukraine, but also studying fashion and luxury business at the EU. Valeria? And we're just waiting for you to unmute as well, and then we'll listen to your question. But we can see you already. Just waiting for you to unmute. So, so maybe before we get to Valeria, then maybe we can turn to Maria Isabel. And Maria Isabel she's from Brazil, but also studying in Barcelona. And Maria Isabel has a question, I think, more about you and your road to the top.
Yes. First of all, we would really like to thank you for being here. It's such a big opportunity, and it's amazing to be able to be talking to an important person like you. My question is personal, as Peter said, and I wanted to know, how did you rise to the position of CEO in such a competitive industry? And also, what made you stand out and make it to the top? If you could give me one advice, what it would be?
That's a very big question, I would say. How I got here, I think it's definitely a combination of hard work and luck. To my earlier point, I think you certainly, I know many individuals who are very talented, who've been in the industry for many years and much more experienced, but who aren't here yet, probably because the lack of timing or fit. So I think there is something to be said about having the right opportunity and just detecting it and jumping on it right away. And also networking continuously would definitely go a long way to help you, achieve the next role, in terms of climbing the seniority ladder. So I would say, probably if I could distill my advice down to a few, it would be one, to develop the thickest skin possible, because, like this, back to my Harvard days, I got turned down so many times for any one of those acceptances. Probably got turned down like 100 and 200 times. I don't know. Like, I've reached out to everybody. I, guessed at everybody's email. I reached out to as many people as possible without having, any contacts. So you really can't be turned down. Even after some people turned me down, I still called them and said, you need to reconsider, you need to, because of this and this and this. And so actually I did have one person reconsider, and he became the keynote speaker later. So I think you just have to continually advocate for yourself and not be discouraged, even if it seems like you start from, really from scratch. And I also would say that whenever you're faced with a very daunting task or challenge, always break it down to tiny, most manageable, little pieces. I don't know if you've ever read this book called, I think the sort of Happiness Advantage, where they talk about success tips. And one of them was the zero circle. And so what they're saying is that you break every daunting task into tiny little pieces, like just focus on one circle at a time and block everything else out, like almost trick yourself into thinking this is all you have to do for the next 5 minutes, for the next 10 minutes. And then as you gain a little bit more confidence in completing that little thing, then you gradually expand your circle to a bigger and bigger circle until eventually you crack the whole thing. So that's something that I truly live by. And, whenever I feel like, oh, can I do this? Or I feel like I have imposter syndrome, or I feel like I don't belong here, or I don't have enough to show for myself, I just think, okay, let me just focus on this one meeting, or this one slide in a presentation, or this one part of the model that I have to build, or this one retailer relationship, and then just block everything else out. And so if you have nothing else to show for yourself, at least you can say that I've done this right. And then you'd be surprised at how much confidence you can gain over time, and then just expand that way. Don't just think, okay, I have to do it all. And then you procrastinate and you're so afraid of it, and then you end up not doing it. So, yeah.
And we've seen that indeed, Lynn, in a microcosm as we prepared this session. I mean, I was very impressed with the way you were very focused and detail oriented in even such a session like this.
What's really important is that you can't just expect to adopt these new technologies and have instant success with your younger, Gen Z consumers. It has to make sense from a strategic perspective for your company. So, you can't just plaster, okay, like here's a QR code, you can scan this and get a virtual experience. Oh, how cool would it be? No, it has to really make sense, whether it's, you want to promote a certain, your retail network or whatever it may be. You want to sort of have that in-store engagement. What has to sort of be embedded in the larger strategy of your company. I've seen many brands, that try and fail at some of these sort of new technology, AI-driven sort of adoptions, and because of the fact that they're just mostly chasing blindly the new fads in the market without really having that long-term vision. So that is a very cool tool if you know, sort of how to place it in your longer roadmap. I would say sustainability is very key. You know, we used to think, oh, there's maybe like Stella McCartney was one of the, you know, forerunners in this market. They always advocated for sustainability. And at the time you think, okay, it has to be a luxury brand. It has to be somebody with a lot of, you know, backing financially in order to afford something like this. But now we're seeing that this is really more and more pervasive in the market, in the sense that a lot of mass players like H&M, Zara, Target, they've also started doing their own sustainability initiatives so that, you know, people don't see them as fast fashion or as wasteful and bad for the environment. So, you know, at Tommy too, we talked a lot about sustainability and making sure that we're carbon neutral by a certain time. So it is becoming increasingly demand driven and something that consumers come to expect. And at the beginning, people didn't really want to pay more for it just because they wanted to see improvement from the brands. But now what we're finding is more of a willingness to shoulder some of the additional costs from both the suppliers and the consumers. So definitely see that trend going forward.
Thank you. And you also talked about, you know, this notion of fads in the fashion industry. If you're going to have it anywhere, you know, sort of trends come and then they go or they stay, but new things come and go all the time. You know, one question we received from Swarna, also who's starting an MBA in the fall at EU, is about one of those new fads, I think, in the finance world, the world of finance, is non-fungible tokens, NFTs. And interesting question, you know, do you see that play a role in the fashion industry, you know, and perhaps even at Jason Wu? Are we going to see like a unique design being sold as an NFT very soon?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, developing digital skins and virtual skins is a new field for many brands. And I think we're seeing, you know, some bigger brands like Louis Vuitton and Gucci certainly dipping their toes in that area. So I think it's a unique innovation and certainly something to be explored. And it's almost complementary to our existing clientele, right? Because obviously the people that are more interested in this are people that tend to skew younger and more digitally savvy than the traditional, you know, couture customers who are maybe older and more affluent. So it definitely is complementary to the existing client base. And it sort of, you know, opens up the possibilities, right? Because consumers have an increasing voice in sort of visualizing and dictating what, determining what a brand can create from a visual perspective. So it's not just a designer comes up with this, you know, collection of these dresses, do you like it or not? But it's a lot of it is consumers demanding sort of more virtual, more 3D sort of renditions of that's based on the designer's inspiration, perhaps is not exclusive to that. So it definitely is more sort of the convergence between the brand and the consumer. So I'm certainly open-minded to pursue something in that field. Yeah.
So we'll see if very soon we can buy an NFT from Jason Wu or not.
Sure.
You know, another question that we got from Neil Patton. Neil, he says he works in the luxury industry himself. You know, in his case, private jets. You know, very different product, of course. But he says, you know, what I see is very little crossover with other luxury or premium brands. And that's maybe an area that could be more exploited still. I mean, one of the places, of course, where we do see it, I think, is in fashion, right? I mean, you can buy shoes or watches of a certain brand that's known as a couture brand, but you can then buy other products from them. You know, what are some areas that you think you'll develop with your partners, Jason Wu, in beyond, you know, the dresses, let's say? What are some other products that you're looking at?
Certainly. So, I mean, I think, again, it goes back to, you know, what's authentic to the brand. And so Jason is, yes, very well-known fashion designer, but, you know, unbeknownst to many, he's also a very talented chef in the culinary field. And that's something that's definitely gotten more and more attention during the pandemic era as we're all locked down. And he just literally, he has an Instagram account called Mr. Wu Eats, where
Wow.
he, chronicles all his, culinary creations on a daily basis. So I would encourage you to go there and take a look. So, we sort of decided to use that and sort of create something based on that passion for food and wine. So, for instance, with QVC later this year, we're going to be venturing into the wine category and kitchenware, in addition to, the traditional fashion for women. So that's just an example of what, other fields we're potentially looking into as we, create more crossover between Jason's many talents.
I mean, that's amazing. This notion that you can also have a Jason Wu kitchen or Jason Wu,
Yes.
menu in your restaurant.
Yeah.
Another question that sparks, I think, is this notion you touched on it briefly in our earlier part of our conversation. Is this the fact that we're now entering a new era? Of course, you referred one of the previous collections of Jason Wu was based on the roaring, or the equivalent of the Roaring 20s in China. Some people are hoping that we're going back to a Roaring 20s, including in New York, in the US, now. But nevertheless, I mean, whether we're going to a Roaring 20s or not, what do you think is next in New York as that city sort of recovers and maybe bounces back and finds new energy in the next years? And how will that affect, let's say, the fashion industry, which of course is home in New York?
Sure. So I think how it'll affect New York probably is, if you walk the streets of New York right now in some of the shopping districts, whether it's Soho or Meatpacking or Upper East Side, or even Fifth Avenue, you see a lot of obviously vacancies from a retail store perspective. So landlords have been hit very hard, and that's something that I think will definitely come back gradually over time. Whether new brands want to engage in a more short-term lease and a pop-up idea or something more experiential. Post-pandemic, I think that's certainly the best time to test out, in a brick and mortar store, in addition to the e-com presence. So I definitely see those empty real estate being put to good use in a way or another. And I think, in terms of the Roaring 20s coming back, I think, there was a very good article recently on the WWD that says that, yes, maybe it is coming back, but, what's different this time is that people are more focused on conscious consumption. To Valeria's point earlier, it's about sustainable consumption. It's not about just splashing your consumption across many things that you find wasteful or that are unnecessary. One thing that consumers learned during the pandemic is less is more. And so we're learning that they want to have a more focused and curated assortment, rather than something there was so much excess in the market pre-pandemic that a lot of that has been right-sized during this period, which I think is a good thing. So now it's more about less is more, but also make it count. So that's where I see the market going.
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? Because those two trends, they seem to go in opposite directions. When I think of like a recovery, a bouncing back, whether of a city or of people, I think of exuberance, right? And that was all the Roaring 20s was all about, right? Is exuberance also in fashion. And on the other hand, you talk about this trend towards sustainability and less is more, and like focus on the basics, etc. How do you marry those two opposite trends with each other?
I think it's about creating items of quality, of long-lasting quality that people can count on. It's not about switching out season after season, but those pieces may be passed down generations, and they have to be obviously made with the utmost attention, and they could be very decadent and could be very extravagant in their designs, but at the same time they most likely have a very effortless and relaxed feel to it at the same time. And nobody wants to be stuck in uncomfortable clothing after this period, I can tell you that. So
True.
It's it's really about creating pieces that last, but that are that doesn't necessarily compromise on quality or on aesthetic in any way.
Yeah. I remember seeing a social media post of like this new fashion where you had the top of it's onesies where the top looks like professional outfit and then the bottom is like basically pajamas. Now I'm sure that that's not something for Jason Wu, but I can see the sentiment there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people, the sale of tops soared during the pandemic because when on Zoom, that's all you see for your team. But people are wearing sweatpants underneath for their own comfort at home. So yeah, it's definitely a trend that makes sense. Yeah.
We only have 2 or 3 minutes left now, Lynn. So I maybe want to ask, a final question about sort of, really your tips, right? I mean, like we've seen it before, we've talked about it before. We get some more questions about this. Do you have to go to a fashion school, or can you also come from a non-fashion university, or when you try to build your own brand, in fashion, how do you do that? Could you perhaps, just to close this out, give us a couple more tips about what makes success in the fashion industry, and how our students can sort of try and mimic your career path and make a.
I don't know about that, but I will give it a shot. So I think certainly you don't have to start out in fashion. Like I said, I was an econ major with a French citation, so I had nothing to do with fashion. But later on, I decided to work in the sort of, even when I was in banking, I was in the consumer retail group. So it was still, you were still interacting with people in the industry, but just from a financing capacity rather than, operationally speaking. So you sort of gain some exposure that way. And you could also, I would say, you don't even have to, if you have a great idea, you just go out there and test it out and maybe create an MVP and see, from an investor perspective, if there's any sort of interest to be had, if you can generate some sort of, make an investment pitch for yourself and just create a simple sort of skeleton startup to see if there's any traction. I know a lot of founders who just feel very passionate about whatever it is that they're doing and have zero fashion experience. And I mean, zero, and later succeeded. And, some of them have already IPO'd. So I certainly think you just have to have that drive, and certainly don't be shy about reaching out to people to get their advice. And to build your network organically and continuously, to my earlier point. And I would just say, focus on, if you're already in the industry, focus on, don't idealize future opportunities. Think about your current team and do the best job you can for your current team, so that hopefully your colleagues now will become your advocates for future opportunities. So, just if you don't have a strong foundation, it's hard to jump from there. So don't just idealize the future. Think about the present as well.
I think that's a wonderful perspective, not just for people who want to start in fashion, but anyone really in their careers, is to focus on the present and enjoy. That's certainly what we've done during this hour, Lynn. We've really enjoyed being in the present with you, getting to know you, getting to know your learnings.
Likewise.
And your lessons. And
absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, that you took an hour out of your busy day. Now I'd say, go and be successful with Jason Wu, in New York. Let's make sure that the roaring 20s are the 20s of Jason Wu. We want to thank you for spending all this time with us. And perhaps we'll hear a final goodbye from my colleague in Geneva, Luc Crane.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Luc.
Thank you, Peter. It has been a great session again. I think fabulous to hear about your insight and your vision on the fashion and retail industry. And I think it has been a great learning for most of our students. So thank you very much for your time. A lot of success to Jason Wu. A lot of success to your future career as well. And I'm going to close with announcing the next Learning from Leaders series that will be on May 20th at 2 p.m. this time with the Emeritus Chairman of Nestlé, Peter Brabeck. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.